Hello, Nick. I think what we'll do is just start out by introducing ourselves. I'll start and then turn it over to you. My name is Stephen Asma, and I'm professor of philosophy at Columbia College in Chicago. I teach a variety of courses, philosophy of biology, science, some philosophy of religion. But I think it's our common interest in images and ideas that have sort of brought us together today. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nick Sousanis. I'm now an assistant professor of humanities and liberal studies at San Francisco State University. And I did my doctoral dissertation at Columbia University entirely in comic book form, and it's now a book out from Harvard University Press called Unflattening, which you drew a comic book about.
That's right. I reviewed it in the Los Angeles Review of Books, right?
Yes. You are the lone comics. Many people threatened to review it in comics, but you were the only one to take up the challenge. And well done.
I've got our sort of shameless self-promotion here. There is Nick's book. And it's an awesome book on flattening. My own little foray, a trifle really, into the field is Buddha for Beginners.
Cool.
And, I think that's it's a common interest that we have to try to do something like intellectual material, philosophy or psychology or really cultural theory in a graphic format. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the sort of origin story, as it were, for Unflattening, and maybe a little bit about the thesis.
Yeah, I mean, I think the origin story is simply that I didn't know any better. It's simply that I just thought, I was making comics. I was a comics maker as a kid, and I returned them. It was sort of a lapsed. I kept making them, but it lapsed in terms of production through maybe my 20s. And then I returned to them and saw the strong potential for doing educational work in comics form and doing things that were not. They could deal with complex ideas, but didn't have to be dumbed down. They could be really dense and really, but through images and the juxtaposition of images and images in text, you could really do complex stuff. So when I came back to school, I said, this is the way I want to do my work because it's the way I work best, and it's a way I can. And I really liked being in academia, but I really didn't like that academia tended to stay in its own boundaries. So I liked the idea that with comics I could reach out and reach people that I really wanted to. So that's, and I didn't know that it was a big deal to do it in comics because I just figured, all those battles with mouse and understanding comics, and it had already been won, like people already accepted comics. So that's sort of how it came to be, or how how I thought to do it. And then in terms of what it's about, it's kind of hard to explain what it's
right.
It's about everything in some sense, but in the other sense, I set out because I didn't know any better that this was really pushing what academia could do. I originally just thought I'm going to tackle something in education in comics, but as I realized the sort of political ramifications of it and embraced them, I ended up making it much more self-referential. It's much more an argument for its own existence. It's an argument for visual thinking and in the classroom and visual methods as scholarship and both production and presentation and research, all being done visually. So it's very much an argument for its own self, but it's all done metaphorically. So I never actually tell you a lot about, I tend to, in interviews and stuff, I tell more about it than the book actually does.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think there's all kinds of stuff in it. There's what we in philosophy would call epistemology, which is sort of theories of knowledge. But really, you range over a wide variety of things, including social theory, psychology, and aesthetics in general. And I guess one of the things I really liked about it was that you were trying to not just, like you said, defend images against really what is still a terrible prejudice, I think, against imagery, at least among academics, but also just show how images can convey deeper ideas and knowledge, and not just sort of illustrate something that could be said in a proposition or in a sentence. So that's what I really liked about the book too, is that you really it basically demonstrates what it's trying to argue in a way. I guess let me ask you this. why is there still so much anxiety or hostility towards graphic novels? Because I agree with you. I thought that this was over in a sense because of the triumph of these other great graphic novels and presentations like McCloud's Understanding Comics and so forth. How much flack did you run into, and what do you think is still motivating it?
Yeah, I mean, I get the question about the flack a lot, and I at least from my committee, I got 0. So I think they were just ready for it. My cohort was a little bit more skeptical, I think. They weren't quite sure. They wanted to see how I could justify it. Maybe out of concern for me getting flack later on, but I have experienced very little, but I still see it. I still see it out there. I still see parents saying, well, we don't want our kids reading comics. I still see school programs where it's cut, where it's not a teacher tries to do it and it's not allowed. I don't know. I mean, I think there's some part of it is that we are so good at reading images that we assume it's simple. I mean, we do it so automatically and without thinking about it, you don't realize just how much you're doing in every time your eyes dart around, you're like, I'm figuring out relationships in the room I'm looking at in you. I'm doing so many processes that it's unfathomable. But I think we discount it for that reason as just images and just. So I say this thing in talks. So I studied mathematics as an undergrad, and when you do that, I feel like you go up and you say, oh, what do you do? And they say, oh, I study mathematics. And somebody says to you, oh, you're so smart, And so when you're an art maker and you say, well, I make comics, they say, oh, you're so talented. Right. And the truth is, I was a very clever, talented mathematician, but I don't know how smart I was ultimately at it. And the flip side, I think my art making has made me so much smarter in what I can figure out that I couldn't do without it. I mean, I'm straying a little bit from your question, but I don't know. The distrust of images is, I mean, as I talk about in the book, it's as far back at least as Plato saying that, seeing a reed bent in water and saying, that's not really bent, so we have to distrust our eyes, and Descartes distrusting our senses altogether. Obviously that move toward rationality allowed us a lot of things, but it threw out all these really important things that humans do to make sense of the world, but we do them so well, we maybe take them for granted. And obviously, and I don't think I spoke enough to this in the work, and I don't think I'm schooled enough in it. Just the distrust of images in an iconography sort of sense is certainly prevalent even today in major institutions. So that may filter into it too.
Yeah, this is a great area because you, like you said in the book, you do a nice job of tracing back the historical origins of this bias or prejudice. And in Plato, you have this kind of divided line, and he's got knowledge is way up here, and the only way to really access that is through mathematics. And then images are way down the bottom, way down there, of the divided line. And other shadow play, you're stuck in the cave. And then you're right. Descartes then tilted everybody towards this hostility of the senses because he pointed out how they betray all the time, that senses are liars, And in my field, in philosophy, it's been a long and damaging tradition of hostility against the senses. And like you were saying here at the end, there's almost the idea that, images, because they're sensual, they can sensationalize. And therefore, they are not going to give you knowledge or truth. They're just going to give you, they're just going to titillate the body, or,
right.
Well, it's just eye candy, basically. It's nothing of any content. And if you want meaning, that's got to be in a proposition, in a sentence of some kind. And at least in philosophy, everybody's taken the bait, certainly in the 20th century, although there's a small group of us fighting the fight to bring back the body. And I see your work as, in a way, really helpful there, because people are working on the idea of literature as a way to access truth, as opposed to just the sciences. But not a lot of people are looking at images or visual thinking or visual literacy. And one of the things I really like about your book is it's giving us examples and a kind of logic for going back to images and talking about images as ways to think through problems. One question I have for you is, I know what you said I think is right. We do a lot of visual interpretation in a very unconscious way without thinking about it. Do you think that, our culture now is more visually literate than previous cultures? Is the sort of dominance of digital technology and the web and this stuff, is it actually making kids more better at visual literacy?
Boy, that's tough. I mean, I don't know about better. We're certainly awash in it, and we're consuming it at greater and greater rates. So maybe the potential is to be better, but I feel like the training to be makers, the instinct to say we can do our own things visually seems maybe not less, but certainly not more. Mm. I mean, I like to think back to like 19th century where every naturalist, every scientist is drawing.
Right.
They all have to do those kinds of things. And I think we don't, I've been thinking about the idea of sort of like slow food, but like slow seeing, like, to like really slow down and draw something or take the time to look at it. I think we don't do that very well. And again, it's partly because we're so good at seeing that we take it for granted, but I don't know. I mean, I think there's a prime moment for there to be a lot of interest in visual literacy. I mean, I just taught a class in visual communications at my school, and I think the kids really, really take to it. And I see people, whether it's that or in workshops, like people who say they can't draw very quickly realize how much they actually do know about drawing and do know about seeing. So I don't know. I think there's a hunger for it in one sense. And in academia, there's a hunger for it through things like digital humanities and stuff like that. But at the same time, what's being privileged in terms of testing and assessment and what counts, it's still going to be textual based. So I don't know studies on this to speak to, but
that's a good point. That jives with my experience too. That I have a 13-year-old son, and he's awash in imagery. Yeah. But I think you're right. And I teach at an arts school, an arts and media school. The training for making, the craftsman training is not really keeping pace with the wash of imagery. And I think you're right. That's causing a number of. I think there's a kind of false sense that we're really good at reading images when, in fact, without this making component, we're not taking images as seriously. For example, like if I'm going to draw something like this cup here I have in front of me, I think there is a sense, I back me up on this or argue, it's either way, but there's a sense in which if I sit down with this thing for a couple hours, I'm going to actually understand the object better. Yeah. But by basically carefully going over the contours and the surfaces. And this is a kind of, I'm not just copying the thing, I'm actually coming to understand it or have knowledge of the object better. And that's, if I was an engineer taking it apart and looking how it went together, we'd all go, oh yeah, you learned something about the object. Right. And I think in a way drawing is like this, but it's not recognized as being able to do this. So a friend of mine teaches art here in Chicago. She was telling me she asks people to draw a cup. And she said, these are people who don't draw ordinarily. She says they'll all draw like a circle at the top because you can, of course, see that there's a circle. But then when you get to the bottom of the cup, she says they'll all put a totally flat line on the bottom. Right. Because, well, it sits on the ground. Right. And so they're not actually seeing that the bottom is also like has a sort of concave or convex, shape that follows the top. And I just think this is really interesting because you'd think, oh, that's got to be easy to read the cup correctly. Right. And yet it turns out there are these huge blind spots for people who don't draw. And myself, when I'm not drawing, I have the same blind spots. Yeah. No, I think I have a lot of responses to that. I think, I'm someone who draws, but I don't draw enough, I don't think. And I know if I'm trying to work through new projects, like I can think about it a lot, but it's really not until I start drawing it that I start to make the connections I need to make. So I think that's one part of that.
Made me think, talking about the cup. I mentioned his work in the book, Alva No. I don't know how to.
Yeah,
Noe.
Alva Noe.
Alva Noe's work. But the fact that, I mean, it's such a simple thing. Like, we all know the top of that cup is round or circular, but we almost never see it as circular. So we're always making that thing that, even though we see, by seeing an ellipse, we also see the fact that it's circular, because we're making all those calculations that, we've seen circles before, and we've seen circles in perspective before, and now. So that's, I mean, just that stands out to me as an amazing cognitive thing going on that we take for granted. And then you sort of, like you're saying, sort of reverse engineer it when you're drawing. You sort of go backwards and figure that out. But then the other thing about, so I mean, there's that kind of drawing, and then so I do something. I do sketch notes. I don't know if you know what that is. I don't do it myself, actually, but I do it with students. It's where they do note taking with drawings, and they draw the fonts out. Maybe they spatialize and visualize taking notes in a class or a talk or something. And it's very similar to visual facilitation, like meeting people. When people are hired by corporations or something to take track of the meetings through pictures. And I think, like, I've had my students do it, and I had this really startling experience with a student who was pretty skeptical about it. And she said, I said, "How did it go?" And she said, "I hated it." And I was like, "All right." And then she followed it up. She said, "But after that class, somebody asked me what we did in class." And she said, "I remembered everything we did in it."
Ah, nice.
So the fact, I mean, like, I think you're saying, when you start observing, when that's about looking at a thing, but here she's making these mental connections by the drawing that made her pay attention in a very different way. And it's not, whatever she produced isn't going to be a piece of art in that sense, but it is going to be a functional idea that she can do something with. And that's really important. And that's the kinds of things I feel like, every student can get into that very quickly. And gain an enormous amount. Whether they're going to be drawers at the end of it or not is less important.
Yeah, that's a habit that I recently discovered is starting to, like, infiltrate. Maybe it's been around for a while. Infiltrate, like, learning and pedagogy teaching. But I also did that when I was a kid. When I was in a professor's class, I did this sort of organic. Oh, he said this word, and then there'd be like a balloon around it, and then there'd be like some tree branch coming off of it, and then some other concept on the tree branch. And I think it just organically and intuitively helped me understand, oh, this concept is inside this concept is inside this phenomenon. And so this makes sense to me in terms of organizing things. And the reason why I like this is, at least in philosophy theories about meaning happens in the proposition. So you make a sentence like "the cat is on the mat." Mm-hmm. Well, you have a proposition with a subject and predicate structure. You can use the word cat and then try to find the referent that it's referring to, and it's a success if it maps or mirrors the referent or something like this. But really, there's this whole other model of meaning of, like, prototypes, where you have a central concept. Like bird or cat, and it's more like an image in your mind, mm-hmm. or something the result of some kind of sketch or drawing, and then you're connecting other things to this prototype instead of having a proposition. And I noticed that your book does some of this too. Like, you have these sort of touchstones that you keep going back to, and I wonder if you could talk about maybe a couple of them. Maybe discuss the sort of influence of Edwin Abbott's Flatland on your book and on your argument. Yeah,
sure. It's actually, people assume, especially by where Flatland shows up in the text, that it was the genesis for the word unflattening, and it's actually totally the opposite. So the word unflattening came up to me as thinking about how much I could do on this static, flat sheet of paper making comics. Like, I could get so much density of information. So I was originally came up with that thinking about, I can make this less flat. I'm making ideas less maybe that's a stretch, but that's what it felt like to me. And then that word started connecting to things I was thinking about, the importance of interdisciplinarity and seeing from multiple points of view, and the sort of threat I see in education where things are very narrow and flattened. So there's those things sort of swirling about. And then I knew Flatland pretty well, and I thought, I have to include it somewhere. You can't make a book about unflattening without mentioning it. And then, because it's one of the few things that sort of moved dramatically in my drawn-out outline that's reproduced in the back of the book, and it was only going to come in at the end. Oh. And then, as I was working, it jumped to the beginning, and then it's repeated. I keep being able to refer to it. So, should I explain it maybe a little?
Yeah, a little bit for viewers who don't know it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Flatland, Edwin Abbott's 1880s novella about. It's a critique of Victorian society, but the mathematics side of it, which I think is what we remember it for, is the story of the geometric inhabitants of this infinite two-dimensional world. So there's circles and squares and triangles and lines, and they know how to move east and west and southwards and northwards, but they don't have any concept of things of upwards. They can't conceive of things off their plane of existence. And I think for us, the Flatlander story is kind of silly. Like, well, of course, there's why can't they just look up or step up? But to me, I was like, well, what's upwards for us? What are the directions we can't think about because our sight won't let us. I kind of hope the sort of simplicity of Flatland serves to help people make that connection. And so it keeps, I keep coming back to that idea of upwards. Like when I talk about my dog's ability to, any dog's ability to, through the sense of smell, the nuanced sense of smell, to have access to layers of time that I don't have. I can come see my chair, and I know it's a gray chair or black chair, I'm not sure. But the dog knows, if somebody else was sitting in it yesterday or 3 days ago or up to a week, and that I just see the color of the chair and the form of the chair. So that kind of access to information or to understanding that we don't have, I think Flatland makes it salient, and I think it says, how can we find other points of view so that we can see upwards? And it's harder to think of. For a Flatlander, it's harder to think about. Right. And for a three-dimensional, for the sphere in the Flatland example, the sphere doesn't, he thinks he's got it all figured out because he's way above the Flatlanders. But then we're equivalent to those. But what's up here? What are those realms of imagination that are out of our sight?
Yeah. I don't know the history of the book. I read it many years ago and I loved it too. Yeah. I think a lot of people really connect to it. I like my understanding is he's trying to sort of demonstrate the possibility of non-Euclidean geometry, basically.
Right.
But I also like that there's sort of a religious aspect of it too, because the being that basically descends into this two-dimensional world from the third dimension is read like a line that just emerges in the field of vision and then grows wide and then gets small again, which is what would happen if you passed a basketball through a piece of paper.
Right. And that's all you can know.
Right. That's all you would know. And I like this as sort of a metaphor of the problem of religious mysticism.
Yeah.
That when you've had a religious moment, you can't communicate it to anybody except given with the sort of tools that linguistic symbols or tools that you have. And so, I think you use it to great effect in the book. And I like this general argument that you're making, which is we, in a sense, have flattened ourselves socially, politically, and intellectually by thinking, well, the way it has been is the way it has to be. Mm-hmm. And that what your book is trying to show that if you change, in a way, if you change media, you get a whole new set of perspectives. Like we were talking about, from language to images, or from images to dance or the body.
Right.
That also provides you with all kinds of new insights that you might not have seen or appreciated before. Let me ask you a kind of a pragmatic question too, which is this book is like one of the things that's so amazing about the book. Let me just show people just one page of this thing, just at random, is how much friggin' work is in this thing. And what sort of annoys me when I draw something like this is that people will only look at it for like 30 seconds. Yeah. And you've spent like a week drawing it, and then somebody just blows through it in just moments. Like, I guess, how do you feel about that is my question.
Well, this is a polite station, right? No, no, I mean, I draw from my own. I'll say two things about the amount of work. Number one, I spend actually more time on the sketches and the movement, the sort of spatial composition, than I do on the drawings, even though I make really detailed drawings. There's a few of them that's the other way around, but I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how all those pieces, and it's always, I don't have a story, so it's like how do I want a reader to feel this idea, and then where is it going to take me? Because I don't usually know until I've made it. So that's, I was glad Harvard put some of the sketches in the back, and I put a lot on my site, because that's really the thinking. The thinking is that activity on the paper, But then as far as them going fast or slow, I do feel like it's a comic. It's hard to read fast. You could just read the text and sort of glance at the images, but I guess I can't care. You would kill yourself if you had to think about, I didn't mean that quite so literal, but I'm just saying you would just be clawing at yourself. I think there's lots of little vignettes, and there's all these things that go on in the background of the comic that I know some people will never see, but they might read it again, or it might be pointed out to them, or I like the idea that the book, each time you read it, is a different book for you, because maybe you read some of the sort of endnote director commentary that I put at the back, so then you're like, oh, this is where this idea came from. And so now you notice something in the image you didn't see before. So I'm okay making stuff that will reward you if you're willing to explore a while. And I'm okay if you don't. I can't. If you're willing to read it, that's a good start, right?
Right. Yeah. That's right. I suppose a book like this self-selects the audience. The audience is going to be drawn to it because they will spend more time, hopefully, on images. But, I think it was. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say to that. So I don't know if I have one on my desk, but I've been printing little miniatures of my work for years, and I used to give them away at conferences, but now I just give them away by every cab driver I had on a trip last week to do a talk. I gave comics to, and it's my dissertation, and it's this book from Harvard Press, and they've read parts of it. And so, what I like about it is because it is comics, and you can read it quickly in some sense and feel like it's accessible. I really like the subversive side of that. I like that they're like, oh, this, all right, I'm going to read a comic, because I couldn't, if I had the text of my dissertation, if I said, here, can you read this?
Right.
I believe it, people are going to kick me out of their cab, or but if I hand them a comic book, they're going to say, oh, well, thank you. That sounds interesting. And then they end up thinking it's going to be simple, and they're sucked in. So I feel very strongly about that, even if they don't get it at the level that you're going to get it, because you know more philosophy than I do. So you're going to see things I don't know about the work.
Well, that's a great analogy too. You see, if a kid watches The Simpsons, he's going to be reading it in a way that's very different from how an adult is reading it. And one of the things, I guess, about the graphic presentation is it disarms people. It reduces their skepticism and their hostility. And they're like, oh, yeah, I'll check that out because I could, comics are fun. And then You're right, you can sort of deceptively guide them to sort of deeper ideas that they might not have ever addressed if you just come straight at them with some kind of philosophy lecture. Right. So that's really an advantage, I suppose, of the medium that I hadn't really even considered before. It's because it has a certain status in pop culture. It allows you to sort of overcome some of the anxieties that people might have for discussing big ideas, like how do we learn or what is knowledge. The average person is not going to want to go at that. So related to this is another issue, which is it occurred to me when you said you give away little parts of it. Are you talking about a little booklet form?
Oh yeah, I'll show. I do have them here. Hold on 1 second. My cord is short here, so.
Because I was thinking about is it Jack Chick who did the sort of proselytizing Christian comics?
No, so I mean, earlier on, it would be like I used to print like full pages, and then I would watch people fold it in half when I gave it to them, and I couldn't take that anymore. So I printed, so it's like a little teaser of the book.
Oh, great.
Probably going forward, I'll add newer work to it and get rid of some of these pages. But, I don't know if it cost me 60 cents a pop to print 3 pieces of paper with 12 sides, but I don't know if it's a money-making scheme because I give them all away, but I figure
it might, people go down and buy the book then.
They might buy the book. They might think about their. I had this very early experience. I lived in East Harlem when I was writing this work, and I had these guys that hung out on my stoop all the time that didn't go to work in any way that and they made income somehow, but it didn't involve going to a job.
I got you.
But we got along great. They were great guys, and whatever, they did what they did, and but I remember I would give them some of the work periodically, and this one guy, so I gave it to him, let's say one day, and the next day I saw him and I said, "What'd you think of it?" And he said, "Yeah, man, it's all about how we perceive things. It's all about how we see." And I was like, that's it. Like, you totally, like, so, to have that, like, yes, I'm having, my dissertation advisors reading it and getting something from it. But at the same time, here's this guy who's maybe finished high school, but he's a smart guy. He just doesn't have the same tools that somebody else had.
Right.
Because of his life experiences, but he can get it and read it, and that just thrilled me.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's the series for beginners that my own book is in. Buddha for Beginners. There's Marx for Beginners, and the mission was originally devised by an African American publisher in Harlem who wanted the average working man to have access to theories and ideas that they ordinarily wouldn't have access to. So that's how the series got developed, and I think that is one of the great things about graphic presentation is that it can reach anybody from all these levels. Yeah,
and I think, just say one. I think they could do. I think you can make comics that make things simple in one sense, and you can also, and I think I'm on the other side of the spectrum because I don't think I'm trying to make them as hard, if not harder. Right. Because they're hard, because there's so many things going on. So I think comics have that flexibility to do everything from, here's the beginner's guide to this, but here's the complex guide to it, but it's not a guide to it. It is the thing, So I think I like the fact that we can be on, just like books can be, but we can be across that spectrum. Anyway, sorry.
Well, let me ask you, along those same lines, there's kind of an emotional spectrum as well as a sort of intellectual spectrum. And when I was growing up and saw those little Jack Chick tracts, which are, for people who don't know, they're like little comics that are written by a very, very devout fundamentalist Christian who is warning kids that they will burn in hell for all eternity if they, if they do X, Y, or Z. And I remember being horrified as a kid when I saw these because the drawing, one of the things about images and drawings is they go straight, it goes straight under the neocortex into your limbic brain and can scare the hell out of you just with one drawing of the devil with fire behind him, And so I think this is one of the reasons why I think images have been seen as suspicious or problematic is because they're so emotional and therefore they lend themselves to things like propaganda and so on.
Which comics have been used as. CIA has dropped comics into Central America before.
Yeah, anyway. So I guess that is one of my questions is, do you worry about sensationalism in your imagery or in imagery generally? Now, I have to say, one of the things I really love about your book is you actually have this totally different emotional palette going on, which I would describe, if Jack Chick and the Christian comic is fear, your book has these wonderful expansive images that give you this sense of wonder or curiosity or even to use the sort of language of the sublime. There'll be some really cosmic image unfolding. And some character will be, tripping along a drop of water that expands out into the, into the universe. That's a very different set of emotions that you're
Yeah.
that you're getting in your viewers. So I guess I'm not sure what that question is here, except have you thought about emotions and images?
I have. I don't know how much I've thought about it in my own making. I mean, I certainly think about it. I mean, to set up this question, you raised something. I mean, the propaganda, the power of images. I mean, I wonder, coming back to your earlier question, if that's not some of the distrust is in
Right.
how easily we can be swayed by images. That, maybe that's a reason people have argued to keep them out. So here I am arguing how strong and potential how much potential they have, but at the same time, that potential could certainly be used for something else, right? I don't know. I feel unqualified to speak to that at all. I feel a little.
That never
nervous.
stops me.
Fair enough. I don't know. I mean, in the emotional side, I mean, it's interesting that the first chapter, which in versions of it, it said, I have a nightmare of flatness, and that didn't make the final cut, and I kind of wish it did, because this first chapter is very dark, and it's not very reflective of my personality, and I know that I would show people it when I was making it, and they're like, wow, this doesn't feel like you at all, but it was set to counter where I was headed. And there's part of me that wonders, it's so dark that, I probably oversold it. I was trying to do a nightmare, so I wasn't trying to present reality, but it really did feel that way. I mean, it feels claustrophobic, and I wanted, everything about the drawings was designed to create that claustrophobic, the weight of all history is sort of weighing down on and flattening us out. So I definitely. Yeah, I mean, I was going for that, so it worked. I think. I don't know. I don't have a great answer here.
I think that beginning section of the book is, as you said, it's very dark and it's disturbing, and I think in a way, it feels very Kafka-esque, which I'm assuming you were sort of going for, because then
certainly
later in the book you're showing how we get out of this problem of. Not just social alienation, but also political and sort of epistemic alienation. Like, we're not thinking in a creative or imaginative way about our social problems, because in a way we're doing things the way we've always done them. And it seems like that's one of the lessons of your book. And you toy with this idea of sort of existential transcendence of the constraints of society, but then you back off that and you say, well, actually we need to really make stronger connections with other people and other aspects of society, so that just like your analogy earlier about your chair, your dog is getting all kinds of information about the chair that you're not getting. So too, there might be elements of society that have a different perspective and take on how we should go forward. And so the book ends up in a very optimistic place, I think. And so you've got a nice trajectory there.
I was always headed there. And you say something, I mean, this may be too much of a tangent, but, talking about how do we connect to other people, my return to comics was making some political comics around the 2004 election. My return to making sort of finished work that I was sharing. And I made more of those, and I made this very early decision on it to start stripping out language and stick to visual and verbal metaphor, because I found that there were people that you could have conversations with, and that you could be very close to, but when you raised certain words, certain party affiliations, or whatever it was, all of a sudden there was a barrier that was impenetrable. And so I started trying to, how do I, it's easy to make a rah-rah comic that says my side is right, and this, right. And that's a fairly easy, and I was never interested in that. I was like, how do I make something that somebody who doesn't already agree with me will stick around, and maybe they're not going to, maybe we're not going to find common ground, but maybe we will at least listen to the conversation in the way that we can have a conversation, and so that was really important to me. So then when I sort of turned to doing my academic work, I tried to keep that same thing in mind. So, I think this book is about education and schooling and disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, but none of those words appear.
Right.
So, I feel like you mentioned schools, and somebody's got an opinion about schools. They've got strong, those teachers or those, whatever they got it. But if I could take you in using visual and using metaphorical ways, maybe, people will say, oh, I can relate to that. That's the pressure I feel in the institution I belong to. And then maybe at the end you realize that I'm also talking about this other thing. So maybe you start to see it from another side. Because I think from when I made it to today, the problem of how to talk to each other is only worse.
Yeah, right.
Terrifyingly so.
Yes.
But I think there's, how do we find ways that we can talk across the gaps seems really urgent to me.
Yeah, sort of apropos of that, the thing about your book that's also exciting is not just a book, but also what it promises for possible future projects, not just for yourself, but maybe other people could try to do things like you've done here in this book. And I have a friend who's an anthropologist, and he has just written a book on using drawing as an ethnographic tool. And he goes into the field and he studies people locally and he learns all about them, but he spends a lot of time drawing what they're wearing, the various ways in which they adorn the body with maybe scarification or maybe jewelry or whatever. And he's trying to make this argument that more anthropologists or academics really should be drawing, because drawing could help them see things about the culture they're studying that just traditional methods like photography or just describing in a journal will not allow them to see. And so I guess I'm wondering, what do you think of this? Do you think that people in various fields like anthropology or psychology or in education should be learning sort of some basic drawing skills? I mean, because right now it's really it's a fairly Gnostic club of people who can draw. Yeah. And, like you were saying at the beginning, you draw and people are just like, wow, that's just amazing. How do you do that? But really, everybody could, like you said, learn to draw some things, get some fundamental moves together. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, do you think that that would be beneficial to be taught at, the primary, secondary, higher education level as part of a tool of scholarship or education? Yeah.
I have a ton of thoughts. First, it's funny, Andrew's work, who you're talking about.
Yeah, Andrew Cossey,
we've connected, and his work, somebody just recommended, I didn't know the book had come out yet, just recommended it to me, and anyway, it's small circles here, but I'm looking forward to seeing that book. Drawn to See, right?
Yeah, I'll have him send you a copy.
And he will make a plug for it here. But there's a field of graphic medicine where people using comics and stuff to talk about illness and health narratives and doctor correspondence. And one of the lead practitioners of it, Susan Squire at Penn State, she said this thing at a conference that she thought every grad student should have a course in making comics. And great. Not because they're going to be comics makers in that sense, but I think it has to do with how you think through image text, spatialization of thinking. I think that's really clear. And for me, I see in my students, and I teach mostly drawing to non-drawers, that it changes what they can see and changes how they can think. And it is nothing about skill. And I think that's a big problem we have, is that the sort of specialization of artists who make things for your walls versus people who use this tool that everybody, our brain is like 40% devoted to visual stuff. Mm-hmm. We're visual creatures. Dogs are not. I don't think dogs should make comic books. They should they should make something, for various reasons. Dogs should not make comic books.
Yes, agreed.
But we, we are visual creatures, and I think everybody is. And it's not about the facility of making a nice line or a thing like that. It's about how to externalize your thinking. And you know it from as simple a thing as if I put my hands behind my back and I can't move, it gets harder and harder to get your thoughts out. We need that expressiveness of the body, and I think using the tool of drawing extends that. So I think drawing as a tool to get our thoughts out is super. I mean, it's essential. I don't know that I want to say everybody has to draw, but I think everybody can.
Yeah.
And I think I do this. I did it as a Twitter activity earlier this year. This drawing exercise. It's a comics making thing, and thinking about the shape of your day, sort of the way that comics are structured. And in 5 to 10 minutes, I have people do this, and they make decisions about, what bleeds off the page, they're making like hundreds of decisions in 5 to 10 minutes with no training, no background, but being human and visual creatures, they're processing the world in this very complex way. So I think I agree. I think we need to make it a fundamental part of education. I guess I would fear, like, I think as rote as math education can become, and I think it's not supposed to be that. I think it's very creative. I think art education can be that way too. Yeah. What are the ads for how to draw the turtle? And if you draw these steps, you can get the turtle. That to me is like, I don't think anybody should try to draw like I draw. This is what happened to me. But I think using that drawing to figure out your thinking is really important. I think coming back to your earlier question about literacy, visual literacy, thinking about visual literacy is that in the way that we think about literacy. Like, we expect everybody out of 100 people, everybody's going to raise their hand and say that they can read and write, or all but one person is going to do that. But I think saying that everybody can draw should be the same number of hands. In the same way that, like, I don't expect that 100 of those people are going to have published work in the New Yorker.
Right.
And I don't expect 100 of these people are going to have work up in MoMA. But I do expect that those people are going to be able to, like, get out their ideas through some sort of sketching and some sort of idea making and visually.
Yeah, I wonder if we could sort of educate people better to understand the different functions of drawing. Because people think, if you draw, you're aiming at being Da Vinci in some way. And really, like, we've already named several different functions of drawing. You were saying you draw in order to express something within yourself, and that could be emotional or cognitive, or you draw to actually represent some object carefully.
Right.
But then there's this sort of third way, which I'm not sure, it's some kind of combination of the two, and that's sort of imaginative drawing, which you do a lot of in the book. And like somebody like Chuck Jones or Hayao Miyazaki, they're using like representational skills, but then they're making, it's a cat that is also a bus, and it it can run on a telephone wire. That's a whole other kind of drawing that I think shouldn't be confused with these other functions of drawing, even though it's great if you can do all of them.
Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead.
No, so many thoughts in here. Yeah, I mean, I think, I almost want to say, and I don't, I did not take art class in school or undergrad because I didn't like it. I didn't like people telling me how to do things, but I really loved, I made comics throughout, I published my own comic, I did this stuff, but I feel like, I don't want to say something too strong, like I don't think we should have art classes that are separate from other kinds of classes, but I kind of think that we should. I think that in the way that you got to write in your math classes and bio, you got to do, you need that tool. How can we make this drawing as a part of our thinking, part of everything we do, rather than we have art class that one period for the special kids. I think that's really doing us a disservice. Not that we shouldn't have people who learn how to make great big sculptures and do the things that, it's not against that. It's to say that we're hurting a huge percentage of our people because they need to have those skills cultivated.
Yeah, I really agree. Nick, it's been a pleasure having
Yeah,
this
this is
conversation.
fantastic.
Yeah, it's really fun conversation, and I appreciate your time. And I
Yeah,
hope we do it
likewise.
again sometime.
I as well. Thank you so much.
Take care.
All right.